Hello. I finally got my air conditioning fixed, and since I am in a good mood, I am going to start a new project, which I think I will be returning to time and again over the next couple of years on the channel. And that will be reading and reviewing every book listed in David Pringle's Modern Fantasy, the 100 Best Novels. I have long been a fan of this book, and it's the source of a lot of my knowledge for when I am thrifting for more obscure fantasy titles. For the last couple of years, Jack over at Sci-Fi Finds has been reading and reviewing every book in David Pringle's science fiction, The 100 Best Novels. And watching through his excellent reviews has given me the motivation I need in order to do a similar project. What I find so interesting about this book, as opposed to other greatest fantasy novels of all time lists, it's specifically modern fantasy. David Pringle deliberately limits himself to a 51-year span, only looking at stuff that was released between 1946 and 1987. This was published in 1988. So while he features plenty of the books that you would expect, he also features many books that you wouldn't expect. For example, works by acclaimed literary fiction authors such as J.G. Ballard, William Golding, or Salman Rushdie. Because he has a much wider scope than just typical epic fantasy, he is able to include many works that stretch the very boundaries of what fantasy can be. And that is exactly the shit I live for. Would you believe that of the 100 novels in this list, I have only read 15 of them? And what do you know? 15 is my preferred number for making ranked lists. So here's what we're gonna do today. I'm gonna discuss with you the 15 books on this list that I have already read, ranked from least favorite to most favorite. These are all pretty good books. That's why they are on the list in the first place. So if something is at the bottom of my list, that doesn't mean it's bad. It just means I like other stuff more. And then every month or two from here on out, I am going to read and review another, let's say 4 to 5 books from this list. Once I have finally read all 100 books, I'm gonna make a big 100 book ranking. It's gonna be so much fun, I promise. But let's just get started with our ranking, shall we? At number 15, we have A Storm of Wings by M. John Harrison, book 2 of his Viraconium sequence. I don't actually own that book, so I am showing the first book, The Pastel City. Viraconium is a beloved series amongst fantasy hipsters like myself. I have read all 4 books, but for whatever reason, they just never clicked with me. I was never able to get into the right mind space to enjoy them. And to be fair, these are very elusive books that demand multiple rereads in order to get the full enjoyment out of them. All of these books are set in and around the city of Viraconium, which is M. John Harrison's dying Earth pastiche, kind of simultaneously set in the far future in the distant past, where fantasy and science fiction freely intermingles with each other. And what M. John Harrison does that I really respect, he goes out of his way to have the world building of each of these novels violently contradict the world building of the other books. He's trying to subvert the obsession that mainstream fantasy has of having everything neatly complement each other. M. John Harrison believes that if you can just use excellent prose to create a vibe that is so strong and so singular, the reader will fill in the world building on their own some. The more I'm talking about this book, the more I'm like, wow, this really does sound cool. So hopefully the next reread will unlock it for me. Book number 14 is something that I do not have a copy of, so I will just talk to you about it. The Crying of Lot 49 by Thomas Pynchon. The Crying of Lot 49 was Pynchon's second novel that he wrote back in the late 1960s. It defined the kind of surreal, conspiratorial style that he would become really famous for. I read this one back in college, and I will freely admit I just didn't really get it at the time, and so this is another one that I should reread. A lot of people recommend and pitch this book as baby's first postmodernism. You read Crying of Lot 49 and it has all of these surreal and metatextual elements. It gives you the building blocks you need to appreciate more difficult works by Pynchon and other postmodernists. But the thing about The Crying of Lot 49 that I wasn't prepared for is it's actually a hyper goofy comedy. Sure, there is this textually ambiguous conspiracy thriller going on in the background where you don't know if Oedipa Maw Moss is actually onto something deeper or if she is just going crazy. But at the same time, Thomas Pynchon just wants to do a lot of silly boomer cultural parodies of the Beatles and other 60s icons. So now that I have read more Thomas Pynchon works like Vineland, I think I would enjoy Crying of Lot 49 a lot more on a reread. Basically, if you love Tim Robinson's The Chair Company, then I think you would find a lot to enjoy in The Crying of Lot 49. Number 13 is 3 Hearts and 3 Lions by Poul Anderson. 3 Hearts and 3 Lions in this economy? I'm gonna make that stupid joke every time. I briefly talked about this book in my Song of Roland video. 3 Hearts and 3 Lions is a foundational work of portal fantasy about a Danish-American man fighting in World War II who magically gets teleported back in time, except it's not really back in time. He goes back to fantasy medieval Europe where he encounters elves and dragons and witches and all these characters from Arthuriana as well as The Matter of France. This was a hyper-influential book on Gary Gygax, and he directly credits it as the reason why Paladin is a class in Dungeons & Dragons. This is a fun and perfectly enjoyable work. The reason why it's lower on the list is because it has been so thoroughly ripped off by half of all fantasy media. The things it does innovatively aren't as interesting anymore. But Poul Anderson would go on to write fantasy that's way better than this. Number 12 is Grendel by John Gardner. This book has a blurb that is always in the back of my mind for how deeply annoying I find it. Grendel, ... a kind of medieval King Kong. What do you mean a kind of medieval King Kong? What is that supposed to mean? Kind of a medieval King Kong. Not even committing to saying this guy's a medieval King Kong. No, kind of a medieval King Kong. Well, is he or is he not? Grendel is famously the monster from Beowulf, or really the first monster from Beowulf, but he is the most iconic. Hulking, man-eating, ogre-type thing who keeps coming to Hrothgar's hall at night and devouring people. And then Beowulf has to go to Grendel's lair and just beat the snot out of him. And then Grendel's mother comes calling, and then Beowulf has to beat the snot out of her. Grendel, the novel by John Gardner, asks the ever-pertinent question, what if Grendel, the monster from Beowulf, isn't that bad of a guy after all? A monstrous being, yes, in form, but it's not his fault that he was born as a monstrous being. So Grendel is the inner monologue of this monster who is just trying to exist in the world, and he's coming across humans. He is trying to communicate with them, but they do not understand his growls, even though he understands them perfectly well. So he kind of becomes this sad outcast. Or maybe you can even say like a medieval King Kong, whatever that means. I remember this being a pretty enjoyable read. I only read it about a year ago, but the moment I finished the book, the entire thing just like drained out of my head. So I remember very little about its actual proceedings, but I think this is a good book. I was actually originally exposed to Grendel as an animation hipster. This was adapted into a 1981 Australian animated movie for children called Grendel, Grendel, Grendel. This cover makes Grendel look scary, kind of like a medieval King Kong. But that movie, he looks silly and kid-friendly, right? So you're more sympathetic to the fact that everyone wants to kill him. He is voiced by Peter Ustinov. Oh, I'm Grendel. The whole movie is just his ASMR monologue, so I didn't really care for it that much. But the animation is fascinating. If you can find access to it, you should check that out. Number 11, The Dying Earth by Jack Vance. I do not own The Dying Earth. That series is ridiculously hard to find physical copies of, so I only have this ugly reprint of one of the later books. The Dying Earth is a book in a subsequent series which is famous for popularizing the Dying Earth subgenre, basically a catch-all term for post-apocalyptic sword and sorcery. Pulp fantasy that is set so far in Earth's future that the world has degraded back into a fantasy milieu. So obviously Dying Earth is the most famous, but you know, Book of the New Sun is a Dying Earth book. Viraconium is a Dying Earth book. Clark Ashton Smith was writing Dying Earth style stuff back in the 1930s. The first Dying Earth novel is a fix-up. It's a bunch of short stories that Jack Vance had published in a variety of magazines, stitched together. So it's not even a novel. It's actually a short story collection. These different adventurers who are going around this weird sci-fi hellscape. The later books are held to be even better. I haven't read those yet, but Dying Earth is a very enjoyable read. There is a story where this guy is trying to steal a ring from this dude named Chun the Unavoidable, and like you see the corpses smattered around Chun's palace, and they all have their like eyes torn out. The protagonist, who is established as being a really bad dude, so you don't care if something awful happens to him, finally about to steal this ring, and then Chun the Unavoidable shows up. He is described as having a cape made of eyeballs, all of the eyeballs that he ripped out from these other intruders, and that is such a grisly, visceral detail. And he's like, I am Chun, I am unavoidable, and he just kills the dude, rips out his eyes because he's unavoidable. Who would win, Randall Thor or Chun the Unavoidable? I put my money on Chun because he's unavoidable. Number 10, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by Clive Staples Lewis. These Narnia covers, painted in the mid-1990s by Leo and Diane Dillon, are the coolest and, dare I say, best Narnia covers ever made. I got this box set of Narnia books when I was 5 years old. The problem with that box set, it is in chronological order. Don't read The Magician's Nephew first. This is clearly meant to be the first book that you read. And I really like The Magician's Nephew. There are so many cool ideas that are packed into the first half of that novel. And then the second half is dumb and boring. Did you want to know why there is a lamppost in Narnia? To which I answer, no, I did not ask that question. I literally do not care. It's a fantasy novel, and there should be whimsy and fantasy in a fantasy novel. Did you want to know how the wardrobe was crafted? No, I didn't. I don't need the lore behind the existence of a magic wardrobe. Still looking forward to the movie though. My favorite Narnia was easily Voyage of the Dawn Treader. That one has so much adventure balanced with weird theological stuff. The protagonist is so charmingly hateable. It's actively rewarding to see him A, get owned, but B, become a better person. While the Pevensey children, who are the viewpoint characters in this book as well as the sequel Prince Caspian, are a little more flat to me. The interior illustrations are the best part of these novels. The sequence where Aslan gets tortured and mutilated always scared me so much, which means that it works, you know. The Narnia books were important to me growing up. I guess my final opinion is that this first book is iconic, but not actually that incredible by itself. It's definitely worth reading the whole series. It goes to such weird and dark theological places, especially the last battle, which really messed me up as a child. Okay, one last thing. Mr. Tumnus is my least favorite character in fiction. I remember reading this as a 5-year-old. You meet Mr. Tumnus. Oh, Mr. Tumnus, I'm a little fawn. I'm a fawn. Mr. Tumnus walks Lucy through the woods, and it's supposed to be all charming, but I always thought of him as a creep. She comes back later with more of her siblings, and when you meet Mr. Tumnus again, he's crying, he's sobbing. What's wrong, Mr. Tumnus? Boo hoo hoo! I've been such a naughty little fawn. I'm such a naughty little fawn. I need a spanking. I'm so naughty. Turns out that he sold them out to Satan. This terrible deed to these children who trusted him. I think he ends up becoming petrified by the magic of the White Witch, and so he's out of commission for most of the rest of the book, and then he gets unfrozen at the end, and you're like, Mr. Tumnus, yay. Except I fucking hate Mr. Tumnus. I hate that bastard so much. Because this is such a fast-paced book that is literally meant for children, he sells them out within the first 20 pages. You had barely met this guy, and he had already betrayed them. Being a traitor is one thing. I kind of wish he was a cackling villain, but he spends like 3 straight pages like, oh, pity me, I'm so sorry. He's a whiner. He's pathetic. pathetic. I hate Mr. Tumnus, and I wish he died. They should have butchered him. They should have made goat stew out of Mr. Tumnus. That's what the bastard deserved. Number 9, Black Easter by James Blish. This is the sequel, The Day After Judgment. The original book is so hard to find. Black Easter is a occult fantasy novel by James Blish set in modern day Earth where demons are real, and experienced occultists can be hired to summon them at the right price, usually to perform assassinations. So literally this book opens up with a guy hiring this occultist to summon a demon to assassinate Ronald Reagan. And this was written 15 years before he had even become president. What a different world that would be, huh? If Reagan got murdered by demons in 1969, that'll teach him to testify before HUAC. What James Blish does, which I think is so cool, all of the demonology is pitch perfect accurate to the way you really summoned demons in the Middle Ages. He actually went to the Ars Goetia and the Lesser Key of Solomon, and he extracts the genuine demonic rituals that you would have used as a 11th century alchemist to invoke Beelzebub. And he puts in all of the rites in the rituals, shows you the entire process. It's so funny because infamously in the 80s, religious parents are like, you can't play Dungeons and Dragons. It's actually all a manual to teach you how to summon demons. Black Easter literally was a manual for how to summon demons. It's a very short novel. It's more about just exploring the idea of this world, but it ends in this really fun twist. Makes you put the book down and you say, damn, that was absolutely crazy. I wonder what happens next. Of course, he wrote this sequel, which I don't find nearly as good. It's mostly the characters from the first book standing around and saying like, wow, isn't the thing that happened at the end of the last book crazy? I mostly remember this book being a bit of a letdown considering how strongly Black Easter ended, but the end of this book, Day After Judgment, is one of the strongest endings I have read in any horror fantasy. Honestly, read Black Easter and then just read the last chapter of this book, and I don't think you would miss that much. I do not own book number 8, so I am just going to jump right into it. The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. I previously included Shirley Jackson's We Have Always Lived in the Castle in my top 25 for last year. The Haunting of Hill House is an arguably even better work. In The Haunting of Hill House, Shirley Jackson effortlessly updates the format of the Gothic novel to the 20th century. Our protagonist has to stay with some other people in this very old and very haunted house where ghosties and other creepy things abound. But what makes The Haunting of Hill House so resonant is the fact that our protagonist is, on top of the spooky house, a very mentally ill young woman. And part of the scares is the ambiguity between how much of it is an actual supernatural event and how much of it is just in her head. You might be asking why this is included in a fantasy top 100 when it seems more apropos for a horror top 100. And the answer is, modern horror, fantasy, and science fiction is all equally indebted to the Gothic literature of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Edgar Allan Poe and E.T.A. Hoffman and Mary Shelley, you see these different strains about fear of the unknown and the darkness of the human spirit that evolves in different ways into these different modern genres. So fantasy, horror, and science fiction, as well as weird fiction, which is the blend of the three, are all equally indebted to each other in various ways. A few years back, when I was starting the process of moving into this house, which is, mind you, nearly 150 years old, there are portraits of the long dead former inhabitants on the walls that I have never touched because I do not want to bring their curse upon myself. During this period, for a whole host of reasons, reasons, I was the most mentally ill that I have ever been in my adult life. And trust me, buddy, that is a high bar to clear. So during this period when I was moving into an ancient, ghost-infested house and endlessly watching Norm Macdonald reruns because that was the only thing that could prevent me from hysterically sobbing about death, I had the deeply stupid idea to read The Haunting of Hill House. So you could say I lived the novel fourth dimensionally as I read it. Since finishing it, I haven't seen any ghosts, so that's promising. Number 7, Titus Groan by Mervyn Peake, Volume 1 of the Gormenghast trilogy. This is a bit of an embarrassment for me because it exposes the fact that I have not read Book 2, Gormenghast, or Book 3, Titus Alone, which are also on this list. I read this a couple of years back and I loved it. I just didn't get around to books 2 and 3 for whatever reason, and I need to get on that train. This is such a fascinating work in the history of fantasy, published about a decade before Lord of the Rings. The very first book chronologically in this David Pringle Top 100, in fact. It is notorious for being a fantasy novel with literally zero supernatural elements. The only thing that makes it fantasy, besides its haunting gothic tone, is the fact that you cannot locate Castle Gormenghast on any world map. This book allegedly follows the title character Titus Groan as he is born to be the 77th heir to the castle of Gormenghast, this ancient keep that is petrified by ancient traditions that have been held in place for hundreds upon hundreds of years. However, throughout this entire book, Titus Groan is just a baby, so you're actually following all of the different characters around the castle, from Lord Sepulcrave himself and the rest of the ruling family to the lowliest serving boy. The Gormenghast trilogy is renowned for having some of the most dense lyrical prose in the entire history of fantasy literature, especially in its descriptions of this ancient dusty castle. But I think the fact that people talk up the prose so much actually ends up discouraging a lot of people from trying it out, right? People will see isolated passages of these lush descriptions. They'll say, oh, that's beautiful, but it seems a little too difficult for me. So what you should actually know is that this is one of the funniest books I have ever read. All caps, British humor with multiple U's. Imagine if you're reading a Discworld novel that just happened to independently have some of the most beautiful, insane prose you've ever read. The vast majority of the humor comes from the whole absurdity of these rigid class positions. All of the nobles are weird and stupid in a upper class way. Everyone in the serving staff in the kitchens are weird and stupid in a very working class way. An indictment of this entire hyper-rigified caste system. I highly recommend it, and I'll get to the other books throughout the rest of this video series. Number 6 is A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin. Easily one of the best YA fantasy novels of all time. Regretfully, it was one of the few that I did not read growing up, and I really wish I did. What can I say? This is the archetypal fantasy Bildungsroman. You are following the life of a young boy named Ged, who, as you are informed in the first paragraph, is destined to become the greatest wizard in the entire land. But before he was this wizard who will be imprinted in song and legend, he was just a regular kid making mistakes and learning about the world around him. The awesome thing about A Wizard of Earthsea, and something that Le Guin is very conscious of, sure, he is learning about magic and he is gaining powers for the first time, but that really does not matter so much as the emotional journey of him growing up and learning to accept himself and accept his own mistakes and become a wholly realized person. In a Jungian sense. Literally. I think this book is incredible, but I think the direct sequel, The Tombs of Atuan, is an even better book about a young girl in this highly restrictive religious society who learns to question the dogma that she was inculcated with from birth through an encounter with Ged. It's a radically different book from A Wizard of Earthsea. It's very small scale and claustrophobic. The interiority of both the characters and the setting is exactly what makes it so good. Le Guin returns to it again and again as she progresses throughout her middle and old age, writing new books like Tehanu or The Other Wind that recontextualize the earlier Earthsea books, especially in terms of gender relations. The Ghibli movie is really bad. Poor Goro Miyazaki, living in his father's shadow at the mere age of 46 years old. Book number 5, I have just finished reading, and that's what inspired me to finally make this video. The Forgotten Beasts of Eld by Patricia McKillip. Patricia McKillip wrote 2 of the biggest landmarks of 1970s fantasy. One is the Riddle Master of Head trilogy, which I read earlier this year, a series that messes around with the format and structure of epic fantasy in very compelling ways. But because everything in that series, from the plot to the character dynamics, are so mysterious, a riddle to be solved, you could say, it holds you at an emotional arm's length. And I was expecting something similar when I read The Forgotten Beasts of Eld, which was McKillip's first work of epic fantasy and the first ever winner of the World Fantasy Award back in 1975. It follows this female wizard who lives by herself out in the wilderness with her posse of magic talking beast companions, the titular Forgotten Beasts of Eld. That's right, she is just like Dar the Beastmaster in The Beastmaster, and in The Beastmaster 2, Through the Portal of Time, and in The Beastmaster 3, The Eye of Braxis. But one day, this woman, Sybil, is trusted with a young princeling to raise as her own. And the fact that she has to raise this young child leads her to eventually becoming embroiled in the politics of this land. This book is very mythic, especially at the beginning. You are inundated with all of these names and places of Sybil's forebears, as well as her different animal companions, all of whom have their own backstories and their own sets of powers. But once you get into the meat of the novel, you realize that all of those names and places don't really matter. They're just there for vibes. This is not a world-building novel, right? It's a deep examination of this all-powerful, sympathetic, but often unlikable character. What is she willing to do to protect the people around her, but at the same time, how far is she willing to hurt the people around her to preserve herself? This is frequently called a YA novel, but in terms of its social dynamics, this is one of the most mature pieces of fantasy that I have ever read. This is a novel where if you read it at 12 years old, you're like, oh, cool story about talking animals and dragons. But once you read it as an adult, as someone who has loved and suffered in the world, it is completely devastating. Excellent read. I need recommendations for late period Patricia McKillip to read though. Now we're getting to familiar material if you have already seen my top 15 fantasy novels list. At number 4, we have The Broken Sword by Poul Anderson. 3 Hearts and 3 Lions is good, but The Broken Sword is way better. This is an absolutely brutal Viking fantasy that was released in 1954, the same year that Lord of the Rings was published. Poul Anderson, who was this American of Danish ancestry who grew up reading all of the Norse myths, you can see him taking a lot of the same building blocks that Tolkien uses, elves and dwarves and rings and broken swords. He uses it to build a fantasy narrative that is much more authentic to the brutality of Viking life than anything that Tolkien does. It's about a human man named Skaflock who was abducted as a child to become the grand champion of the elves, and about the changeling who is left in his place, who kind of grows up to be his shadow inversion and his greatest rival. The notion of grimdark fantasy isn't nearly as popular as it was, say, 10 or 15 years ago. I think people have come to realize that artificial nihilism does not necessarily make for better writing, especially when it culminates in some of the worst novels ever written by human beings. But I still think that there is this natural core desire to read fantasy literature that doesn't shy away from the darkest aspects of the human experience. In a way, it can be comforting in a world where everything genuinely is terrible and nothing is getting better. That's why the popularity of works like Malazan Book of the Fallen continue to reign supreme. And so here's my pitch to you. Do you want to read a tight, grippingly written work that has all the butchery and and brutality of Malazan, less than 200 pages long. Book number 3, Little Big by John Crowley. This is truly a miraculous book. Maybe the platonic ideal of literary fantasy. And what I mean by that is that it works equally well as fantasy and as quote-unquote high literature. Little Big is a tome, it's a bit on the thicker side, following multiple generations of the Drinkwater family, who for the most part live in this giant, bizarre house that is this mishmash of all these different architectural styles. That the lives of the people depicted in this book are so interesting is meant to distract you away from the fact all of their lives are deeply impacted by the fairies who live on their property. The presence of the fairies isn't exactly explicit. You have to spot their obscured traces in the lives of these characters. Is magic real, or is it just a fantasy? For most of human history, that's one of the biggest ambiguities there is, you know? And by crafting a world where magic may or may not be real, John Crowley illuminates the mundane magic of everyday life. This is one of the most beautiful novels I've ever read in terms of raw prose. Imagery that John Crowley is able to produce of just people living normal human lives is so emotionally affecting. And I think the secret for why this book is such a masterpiece is that even if there were no supernatural elements, it would still feel like magic. Number 2, The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle. The Rankin Bass film adaptation of The Last Unicorn is one of my favorite movies of all time. The book and movie are very, very similar. Peter S. Beagle wrote the screenplay, right? He made sure that it was a very faithful adaptation. So I kind of have difficulty talking about it objectively as a work of fiction. What if you wrote a fairy tale novel for children about the nature of mortality? If you allow me to be pretentious for a moment, it invokes mono no aware, which is the Japanese term for cognition of the fact that everything is going to die and literally nothing you do can stop that. There's like 5 different sequences in this that can make you cry. Oh geez, I forgot to mention, this is signed by Peter S. Beagle. Would you look at that? In the distance, hear her laughter. It's the last unicorn. Don't even get me started on the Flight of Dragons. We have reached the final book, and although I always like to break convention, it is going to be the single most obvious choice, The Lord of the Rings by John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. This is my copy of Fellowship that I was gifted at 8 years old. I really appreciate this Ted Naismith art. It has Glorfindel on the back. How many pieces of post-Jackson Tolkien merch give Glorfindel his due diligence, huh? Glorfindel was the hero of the Battle of Gondolin. Do we forget so easily? Glorfindel is the one who originally came up with the prophecy that no man could kill the Witch King of Angmar. Do we forget so easily? One of the funniest aspects of Tolkien lore is realizing that he had to come up with a mechanic of elf reincarnation because he used the name Glorfindel for like 3 completely different characters, and he had to form an elaborate retcon to make them all the same dude. Like the guy on the back of the Ted Naismith cover, the hero of the Battle of Gondolin. Some of my most treasured early memories are my dad reading The Fellowship of the Ring aloud to me when I was a small child. My elementary school experience was defined by watching the Jackson movies and slowly but surely making my way through the original novels. Though I don't actually finish them 100% until early middle school, I think. I remember in 3rd grade, it was one of those casual assignments. Oh, memorize a short poem and then share it with the rest of the class. And for my presentation, I said, I would like to share the One Ring poem from The Lord of the Rings. And my teacher was like, oh, that's nice. And I followed it up with, in the original Black speech of Mordor, Ashnaz der Batulek, Ashnazgim Batul, Ashnazder Katulak Agbersham Ishikrim Batul. And the next couple of years, I was like, damn, why don't any of the girls want to talk to me? It is very difficult for me to talk about The Lord of the Rings objectively because it is so tied up in my development as a human being. A few years ago, I read the Silmarillion to completion. So having finished the Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales, I went back and did my first full reread of The Lord of the Rings in many years. It was even richer and more beautiful than ever before. This wasn't any sort of childhood nostalgia talking. These books are incredible. They are not without flaws, but they are very, very good. Reading through the whole thing and then hitting the final chapter is one of the most cathartic experiences you can have in fantasy. That final line spoken by Samwise Gamgee wrapping up the book hits like a brick. Even though I am listing The Lord of the Rings as my number one pick of the 15 books I have read of the 100 best novels of modern fantasy, I want to make it very clear that doesn't mean it's automatically going to be number one in my final ranking. I want to take this opportunity to talk about a little quote from the late Sir Terry Pratchett, one that I ruminate on a lot. When Sir Terry Pratchett was asked about Tolkien's influence on the genre, he responded, J.R.R. Tolkien has become a sort of mountain, appearing in all subsequent fantasy in the way that Mount Fuji appears so often in Japanese prints. Sometimes it's big and up close. Sometimes it's a shape on the horizon. Sometimes it's not there at all, which means that the artist either has made a deliberate decision against the mountain, which is interesting in itself, or is in fact standing on Mount Fuji. I hate this quote and I think it is bad. I am not denying that Tolkien has had a massive impact on modern fantasy or the elegance of the metaphor in Sir Terry Pratchett's quote. However, whenever I see someone online say, hey, I'm a little tired of mainstream epic fantasy and I want to try out some works that aren't as indebted to Tolkien, every single time there are 15 people rushing to spam that quote as fast as they possibly can. It's used as a thought-terminating cliche to shut down the entire conversation. I think there is a lot of nuance in the original quote, but it's often misinterpreted to just mean, Terry Pratchett said that all fantasy is based off of Tolkien, so all fantasy is based off of Tolkien. There are so many traditions of fantasy that predate Tolkien as well as post-date him. Even if we ignore the rich wellspring of pre-modern fantasy, modern fantasy existed for 96 years before the publication of Lord of the Rings. And while, yes, a good portion of commercial fantasy ended up following in Tolkien's footsteps, there were dozens of traditions and subgenres of fantasy that had nothing to do with Tolkien that proliferated before him and proliferated after him. I went back and I checked my personal top 15 fantasy books of all time video, and almost every single one of those books have literally nothing to do with Tolkien and his influence. The only exceptions being The Tough Guide to Fantasyland by Diana Wynne Jones and The Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien. If we claim that every fantasy novel is reacting either directly to Tolkien or reacting against him, then that diminishes and erases thousands of excellent novels from a host of talented men and women from literally all over the world. I will not let the efforts of those men and women be forgotten. One of the primary reasons why I am so excited to read the other 85 novels in David Pringle's list, only about 10% of the novels in this book have anything to do with Tolkien and his influence. And I have already listed a good portion of those novels today. I currently have Lord of the Rings ranked as my number one book of all time from this list. There is a very good possibility that by the end of this project, it will remain #1 of all time. Lord of the Rings is a masterpiece after all. Think of how cool it will be if I find a book, or dare I even say multiple books, that I think are even better than Lord of the Rings. Isn't that deeply exciting? To paraphrase the iconic walking song from Tolkien's Legendarium, the road goes ever on, and I must follow it if I can. I'll see you next time.